At this point, I would like to introduce you to Ambassador Lincoln Bloomfield, former Assistant Secretary of State for Political and Military Affairs. Ambassador?
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. I want to say a big hello to the members of the Organization of Iranian American Communities, OIAC, a strong group of 40 different branches across America, proud Americans of Iranian heritage, many of whom have had their families victimized by this regime in Tehran. And I want to especially pay my respects to all the friends and families and survivors and witnesses of the 1988 massacre of political prisoners, which is being commemorated here just below the US Capitol. Now, why are we talking about an event that happened in 1988? There are many reasons. One, we didn't know at the time what had happened. The information came out years later, in 2009, 2016. We are still learning more about the details of what happened in 1988 in July and August. Secondly, now we realize that this is one of the most severe crimes against humanity since World War II. It has been compared to the Bataan Death March and the Srebrenica massacre in Bosnia. This is a major crime. There is no statute of limitations. And the third reason is probably the most important, and that is that people who participated in this killing of thousands and thousands of political prisoners, most of them in the MEK, the Mujahideen-e-Khalq, which is part of the National Council of Resistance of Iran, represented in Washington by Ms. Samsami. Many of these people have never left the regime. They've only grown in influence. They've been part of the regime. They are still around. And of course, one of them today is the president of Iran, Ebrahim Raisi. Americans can relate to this. This is not some odd foreign issue. Americans have watched with great sympathy as the families who grieved those people who were killed in Buffalo or Uvalde, Texas. We've been reminded of the massacre of children in Connecticut at Sandy Hook this year. This is the same. Relatives and friends are here looking at the pictures of these brave young people who would not renounce their views and who were sent to their death. You'll hear a lot about the massacre of 1988, but I think I want to show you what really happened at that time. Geoffrey Robertson, an eminent British foreign human rights lawyer, wrote a report, one of the first reports that told what happened in 1988. I'd like to quote from his report. Listen carefully and imagine what this was like for the victims. It involved a 3-judge panel in several cities of Iran. This was called a delegation, but it was later termed a death commission by people on the outside. The death commissions convened and interviewed every person who was a political prisoner. Many had finished their terms of their prison terms and were at home. And they were dragged from their homes before a delegation. The delegation was always made up of three people: a religious judge, a public prosecutor, and an intelligence chief. These were the death panels. And they were asked one question. The question is really important. You'll find that none of these people were criminals. None of these people committed acts of violence or terror or any of that. This was about their political views and their religious views. I'm quoting from Geoffrey Robertson. The delegation had but one question for these young men and women, most of them detained since 1981, merely for taking part in street protests or possession of political reading material. And although they did not know it, on the answer, their life would depend. Those who by that answer evinced any continuing affiliation with the Mujahideen were blindfolded and ordered to join a conga line that led straight to the gallows. They were hung from cranes, 4 at a time, or in groups of 6 from ropes, hanging from the front of the stage in an assembly hall. Some were taken to army barracks at night directed to make their wills and then shot by firing squad. Their bodies were doused with disinfectant, packed in refrigerated trucks, and buried by night in mass graves. Months later, their families, desperate for information about their children or their partners, would be handed a plastic bag with their few possessions. They would be refused any information about the location of the graves and ordered never to mourn in public. By mid-August 1988, thousands of prisoners had been killed in this manner by the state, without trial, without appeal, and utterly without mercy, unquote. Yes, there was a news blackout. The regime said nothing about this mass murder of innocent political prisoners. In fact, the Human Rights Commission sent a special investigator because the word had leaked out to find out, was this true? What had happened? The Iranian regime lied to him and denied anything, which is why we have waited years to find the truth about the massacre of 1988. Ayatollah Khomeini was a year from his death. He was elderly and infirm. He was the one who ordered the massacre. And he said, and I quote, "As long as I exist, I will not allow the regime to fall into the hands of liberals." Listen carefully to what Khomeini said. He didn't say fall into the hands of violent criminals or lawbreakers, liberals. This wasn't about crime. This wasn't about terrorism. This was about politics and ideology, because the MEK, these young mujahideen, had a different view of politics. They didn't want to be subjected to religious tyranny of a dictator with a divine mandate in his constitution after years of repression under the monarch of the Shah. And they were also Muslims, which made them much more important to Khomeini, because they wanted a society of educated men and women with political rights and political agency, the ability to progress in society. And they believed, the Mujahideen fervently believed, and they still do today, that they are good Muslims and that this is consistent with Islam. Khomeini could not tolerate that point of view, and he tried to exterminate their beliefs. Now, why is this important today? Ebrahim Raisi was 20 years old when the revolution happened. Now, I'm sure many of us know 20-year-olds who are very bright, very smart, who have learned a lot in 20 years. But to become a judge at the age of 20 means he could not possibly have known anything about international law or the canons of law or even Iranian law. His job from the age of 20 was to make sure that anyone who challenged the regime was put in jail, tortured, and executed. And he did it very efficiently. He was loyal to the regime. And over the years, he grew in power to the point where, in 1988, Ebrahim Raisi was a key member of the death panel of Iran, sending thousands of young MEK to their deaths. He is directly culpable in one of the largest crimes against humanity of the 20th century. And there has been no accountability to date. After 1988, Raisi rose to become the head of a very large religious foundation, Setad. In 2013, Reuters said Setad had approximately $95 billion of assets. This is a slush fund for the senior ayatollahs under the control of the supreme leader. So Raisi not only was an enforcer for the regime, using the judicial system to crush any alternative views to the regime, he was also the money man under the supreme leader. And it's no wonder that Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei wanted him to run for president in a very controlled election of 2017. Only he and President Rouhani had a chance of winning. Rouhani was reelected in a very undemocratic process. But this time, in 1921, in the next election, the mullahs didn't take any chances. They made sure that Raisi became president in 2021. Why? Because Ayatollah Khamenei will not be around much longer, and he needs to pick his successor. Many people believe Raisi is lined up to be the next supreme leader of Iran. All of this is happening while Raisi is planning to come to New York next month as the president of Iran for the General Assembly meetings at the UN. Iran doesn't seem to care that the press is reporting violent attacks and court cases in Europe. Raisi is responsible for the threat that closed down the MEK and NCRI rally last month in Albania. We just learned this week that the Revolutionary Guards tried to bribe and pay an assassin to kill former US National Security Advisor, Ambassador John Bolton, right here in the nation's capital for $300,000. I thank the US security services for intercepting that plot and preventing it. We've seen Masih al-Najad, where there's a man with an AR-15 stalking her apartment in New York. We've heard today that Salman Rushdie was stabbed on stage in New York. These acts undoubtedly are connected back to the Iran regime. And where is the accountability? I think John Bolton deserves to be quoted after what happened with this threat with him this week. So I quote him now. One point is indisputable. Iran's rulers are liars, terrorists, and enemies of the United States. Their radical anti-American objectives are unchanged. Their commitments are worthless, and their global threat is growing. Now, those of us in Washington know that John, who is a friend of mine, we don't always agree with his point of view. There are conservatives who agree. There are others who don't adopt all his views. But on this point, can anyone say that John Bolton is wrong about Iran? I don't think so. I think we've reached the point where all Americans have to face reality and admit that we have seen enough. For 43 years, we have been deceived by this lawless, corrupt band of clerics using religion to gain and maintain political power. This is a regime that cannot survive without executing its detractors, attacking its neighbors, and intimidating exiles around the world with threats to their relatives and acts of terrorism. The United States and its democratic allies must take collective action to pursue truth, justice, and accountability in Iran. That is why I support a formal multinational investigation of the 1988 massacre of political prisoners, including the personal culpability of President Ebrahim Raisi. Witnesses and survivors of this crime against humanity are in Albania today, right now, waiting to provide their personal testimony. And like so many here today, including members of Congress and fellow Americans, I call on the US government to block Raisi from setting foot on American soil when the UN General Assembly convenes in New York next month. I can think of no better way for the Biden administration to demonstrate that upholding human rights is indeed at the center of our foreign policy. America stands with political prisoners in many countries, Ukraine, Hong Kong, Taiwan, around the world. The world can see that there are 80 million political prisoners today in Iran, the Iranian people, who are clearly desperate to be free from religious fascism. It is time that Americans unite in support of their human rights and support their hopes for a bright future in a free Iran. Thank you.